What if the most important thing about you isn't what you do or what you say, but what you think? Welcome to Sunday School Shorts. Over the last several weeks, we've been taking a broad 50,000-foot view of the gospel story. This perspective gave us a general outline of the story of everything that exists. We saw our origin story in the biblical creation narrative, but not just us, but the stars in the sky, the metallic elements of the earth, and planets like Pluto. Wait, is Pluto a planet anymore? I can't keep up. Anyways, from atomic particles and dark matter to the narwhals and unicorns, well, at least one of those horned creatures is real. Sorry, unicorns. The next part of the story, The Fall of Man, tells of the hero's tragedy, which put all of the created order under a curse. But a new hero would soon arrive on the scene to start to make things right again, and one day he will return and finish what he started. If you haven't seen those videos yet, I encourage you to check them out, but you won't have needed to see those in order to understand what we're going to be talking about today and continuing on in the coming weeks. Over the next couple of videos, we're going to spend some time looking at the gospel story from a human perspective. Where do you and I fit into all of this? So now that we're done hang gliding over the forest, it's now time to lace up our hiking boots and hit the trail to get a closer look at the gospel story from on the ground. But before we get started, it's time for the lesson plan. Today we're going to look at God. It has to start there. After all, the first words of the Bible are, "In the beginning, God." Then, in the next video, we'll look at man. Where do we fit in, and how do we relate to this Creator God? Following that up, we'll look at the person of Jesus. He seems to be a pretty big deal. I mean, the way we reference what year that we're currently in is in direct reference to his birth. Finally, we'll conclude with a video talking about our response to all of this. A.W. Tozer wrote in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, quote, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. The history of mankind will probably show that no people has ever risen above its religion, and man's spiritual history will positively demonstrate that no religion has ever been greater than its idea of God. Worship is pure or base as the worshiper entertains high or low thoughts of God. For this reason, the gravest question before the church is always God himself, and the most portentous fact about any man is not what he at any given time may say or do, but what he in his deep heart conceives God to be like." End quote. We all have thoughts about God. We do. Even if those thoughts are, he doesn't exist. That in and of itself is a thought about God. And what we think about God actually defines us and how we live. If we think he exists, then we typically live our life in one particular way. And if we think that he doesn't exist, then we go about our life in another way. But this isn't a video where I'm going to try to prove that God exists. Today, I just want to open up the Bible and see what it says about who this God is. Because whether we believe in him or not, any misconceptions or wrong thoughts about who he really is has major implications for our lives. Think about this, for example. If my understanding of who God is of that of an angry father, I'm probably going to want to keep my distance or want nothing to do with him. Or, on the opposite end of the pendulum swing, I'm going to be working overdrive to try to do something to appease that anger and make him like me more. And neither of those are treadmills that you should want to get on. So that's why it's extremely important that we have an accurate understanding of who God is. But even if you're here as a skeptic or agnostic or atheist or a follower of another religion, then at least consider this video as a brief character analysis of the God of the Bible. Thanks for being here, by the way. Now, one of the most common mistakes people make over and over again when reading the Bible is thinking that it's a book about us. Spoiler alert, it isn't. We are not the main character of the story. God is. And this matters a whole bunch. We often can read the Bible trying to see where we are in the story, and in doing so, we completely swing and miss on what it's trying to tell us. And the funny thing is, we don't do this with any other literature. So am I the beautiful butterfly or the fat caterpillar? Don't. So why do we do that with this book? In a way, I get it. This book supposedly tells us how we should live, offers wisdom for life, and it boasts of containing a message of eternal life. But we also tend to act pretty goofy with it because there's a supernatural element surrounding it as well. Okay, God, should I take that job promotion? You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. But in order to properly understand the Bible, we need to understand what the original text said in its original context, and how the original hearers of the text would have interpreted it. And one of the primary features of the Bible is that the main character of the story is, you guessed it, God. But who is God, and what is he like? Let's turn to the text, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The original text would have been written in Hebrew, and the word here used for God was Elohim. Sometimes the word Elohim in general can refer to gods with a lowercase g, but the biblical writers use it many times in a unique way to refer to the supreme God or mighty one. Now imagine yourself as an Israelite at the time that this was being written and taught to you. You are part of a people who just escaped Egypt through a miraculous deliverance across the Red Sea, and you are surrounded by many other nations who worship many other gods. Moses, who it is believed to have written this text, is saying here, the God with a capital G created everything. Forget about all those other little g's. This is the OG, and those others can't compare. This God created everything ex nihilo, which is Latin for out of nothing. He didn't use any pre-existing material, like a child building a spaceship from Lego pieces, or scientists creating stronger and more resistant vegetation by splicing fragments of DNA together. God speaks and things are, and that's not just limited to the things explicitly mentioned in the text here. He created time, space, and matter, which means that God is outside of time, space, and matter, but also in time and space and matter. He's both atemporal and temporal, and spatial and aspatial. And this is where my brain starts to melt a little bit, because how can that be? This is the problem we encounter when the finite attempts to comprehend the infinite. The psalmist would write, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable." Again, great is our Lord and abundant in power. His understanding is beyond measure. And also over in the book of Job, behold, these, talking about the created order, are but the outskirts of his ways. And how small a whisper do we hear of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? We don't even know a percentage point of what God is like. God simply breathed out air and poof. Giant dwarf stars and plankton and trees and colors and electrons and isotopes and joy and delight and laughter. I mean, I sometimes put my shirt on inside out and don't notice for half the day. He's so unlike us in his godness. But just because we don't know him in full doesn't mean that we can't truly know anything about him. We can know what he's chosen to reveal to us. And one way that he's chosen to do that is by giving us this book. Now, if you were to open up a theological textbook and flip over to the section called The Doctrine of God, you might see a subsection called The Attributes of God. These attributes are often divided into further categories, such as the incommunicable and communicable attributes of God. Incommunicable attributes simply means things about God that are true for God and God alone. Things such as being infinite, self-existing, and omnipresent. Communicable attributes are traits that we as humans can share in, such as the moral attributes of love, goodness, and kindness, to name a few. And these are ideas and concepts that not only we can comprehend, but we too can mirror and reflect and demonstrate these attributes ourselves. Another way to frame these two categories are as attributes of transcendence or otherness or godness, and attributes of immanence or his nearness or his closeness. Over in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul found himself in the city of Athens and noticed that the city was full of statues and altars to other various gods. If you're familiar with Greek mythology at all, it's easy to imagine this scene. Here's what it reads. Acts 17, 23 through 28. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. What you therefore worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. God is both so unlike us and far from us, but at the same time so near and close to us as well. And it's important to have a high view of each of these two categories and not exalt one over the other. If we overstress his transcendence to the neglect of his immanence, then we can be tempted to think that God is distant and unapproachable or unrelatable. But if we rush to his immanence or closeness and we don't properly understand his greatness, then we still don't have a proper understanding of who God is. Sure, we all want to talk about the love of God and the compassion of God and the mercy and grace of God. I'm a big fan of all of those things. But we can't truly understand those things without also having his greatness and his transcendence as a backdrop, along with all of his other attributes such as his holiness and his wrath, his righteousness, and his justice. C.S. Lewis beautifully illustrates this delicate balance in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe when Mr. Beaver tells Lucy that he intends to take the children to the lion Aslan. Here's what it reads. Is he a man? Asked Lucy. Aslan, a man? Said Mr. Beaver sternly. Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. In the process of writing this episode, I was once again confronted with and reminded how often I forget just how big and transcendent God really is, and yet how near and close he is as well. I'm a Christian, but I too can often be tempted to think that I've got God all figured out. Anytime you've studied a subject long enough, you might feel like you've got a good grasp on it. But I need a constant reminder that even my best and most accurate thoughts about God aren't sufficient. His goodness is greater than I can imagine. His love is sweeter. His righteousness is purer. His justice is more just. His wrath burns hotter. And yet his mercy and grace is deeper. On that note, it's snack time. Today's questions are, do you believe in God? Why or why not? If so, what do you think God is like? How does your perception of God compare with the Bible's portrayal of God? And finally, is it possible that perhaps your God is too small? Alright, in closing today, I want to leave you with yet another C.S. Lewis quote, which I think pairs quite well with the A.W. Tozer quote that we referenced earlier. This is from Lewis's work, The Weight of Glory. It reads, I read in a periodical the other day that the fundamental thing is how we think of God. By God himself, it is not. How God thinks of us is not only more important, but infinitely more important. Indeed, how we think of him is of no importance except insofar as it is related to how he thinks of us. Hey, thanks again for all your support as I try to get this thing off the ground. It really means a lot to me that anybody would watch this. If you want to further help me out, please give this video a like and a share. Tell your friends about it. If you haven't subscribed yet, give that button down there, the old clickety-click. You know how this YouTube thing works. If you feel inclined to support the channel even further, I've also set up a Patreon page with different tiers and giving levels, so you can go and do that. But even if you're not interested in doing that, I'm still grateful that you would take a few minutes out of your day to be here right now. So with that, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.